Hello and welcome to the Instant Impact Diversity Hub. Recruitment is the only real way to drive diversity in your business, because without hiring new talent, it's going to be very difficult to affect change. My business, Instant Impact, are internal recruitment experts, and we implement a three-part methodology to drive diversity for all of our clients. This video follows Sophie's video on influencing internally, Elaine's video on attracting a diverse pool of candidates, and today we're going to focus on the third step of the methodology, how to create a fair assessment process. Before I start, I want to thank the academics whose research we'll reference throughout the video today, as well as our technology partners, Applied, who we've collaborated with on a number of the slides. I'm going to start today by addressing the problem that's the mandate for changing our existing setup, before then looking at the positive action that you can take, as well as some of the drawbacks that it might bring. And we're going to finish with our recommendation on how to change your existing process, as well as how you can use data and reporting to continually iterate and improve. So what's the problem? We think the problem is illustrated quite neatly in a study by Doris Wiechelbaumer for the Institute of Labour Economics in Germany. She ran a piece of research where she applied for a wide range of roles using almost identical CVs. The only thing she changed was the name and the photo that accompanied it, and the results were quite remarkable. The German-sounding and looking Sandra Bauer received interview requests for 19% of her applications. The Turkish-sounding Meryem Öztürk, with otherwise exactly the same profile, received interview requests for 14% of her applications. And when the photo had a headscarf but the CV was otherwise unchanged, Meryem Öztürk received interview requests for just 4% of her applications. It's clear then that Meryem and Sandra are not operating on a level playing field. Now, when you talk with your team, it's easy for them to say, that's all well and good, but I'm definitely not biased. We recommend a good free resource to bring the point closer to home for your team. Project Implicit has been developed by Harvard and measures participants' implicit associations about race, gender, sexual orientation, and a range of other topics. Doing the test isn't an easy experience. It's very difficult to accept that we all have unconscious biases, but it is important to know where and how those biases can affect our decision-making and the decision-making of others so that we can mitigate against it in the assessment process. If you've watched our Diversity Hub video on influencing internally, you'll have heard Sophie recommend having a training program for anyone involved in your hiring process. And you'll also have heard her recommend including unconscious bias within that. We'd suggest using a tool like Project Implicit or one of the many other tools online. But it's important to be clear that the aim here is not to train people out of their unconscious biases. That would be far too challenging. The aim is to make them aware and to give them the tools to combat those unconscious biases and to make sure that they don't impact the recruitment process. And we need to do that. We need to do that so that we can start evening the playing field and improving the shocking statistics. In the UK, less than 10% of executive positions are filled by women, and only 6% of top managerial positions are filled by employees from a BAME background. Now, the temptation when you hear stats like that is to immediately look to set quotas or targets to increase the number of employees from minority groups within your business, to use positive discrimination. While the aim is laudable, positive discrimination is illegal in the UK under the Equality Act 2010, as it does not give equal treatment to all. You cannot hire an individual purely based on their protected characteristic. You have to hire the best person for each role, and rightly so in our opinion. That said, positive action, also known as affirmative action, became legal in April 2011. Positive action allows employers to take measures to address any imbalance within the company that an employee or potential employee could face. Elaine has already discussed some of the positive steps that you could take in attraction, for example. Positive action also allows you to choose to hire or promote an individual from an underrepresented background when they are equally as well qualified as all of the other candidates. As long as you're careful to avoid discrimination, we're in favour of both of these forms of positive action to help turn the tide on the shocking statistics that we've already run through today. If you're interested in learning more on this topic and the distinction between positive action and positive discrimination, there are more details in our Diversity Hub. But I do want to talk about one type of positive action today that's really relevant as we talk about having a diversity-centric assessment process, and that's the Rooney Rule. The Rooney Rule was established in 2003 by the NFL and requires that American football teams interview ethnic minority candidates for all senior roles. In essence, there's an interviewing quota rather than a hiring quota. It was brought in to address the underrepresentation of non-white head coaches in the NFL, because while 70% of players are non-white, just 9%, or 3 of the 32 head coaches, were non-white at the start of the 2003 season. The rule's been widely applied at a variety of different organisations with different interpretations covering all forms of diversity. If your organisation suffers from a fundamental and deep-rooted issue with diversity, as is well documented to be the case with the NFL, implementing the Rooney Rule could be a great first step. Makes your team aware of the issue and ensures that candidates from minority backgrounds at least have a chance. They can't all be screened out at CV stage, as was the case with Maryam in the study that we went through earlier. So let's have a look at the results in the NFL since 2003. There was almost an immediate increase in the proportion of non-white coaches, and things were trending well into the early 2010s as a result of the Rooney Rule, or potentially as a result of the Rooney Rule. Although there was clearly still room for improvement if we remember that 70% of the players are non-white. Then we head into a downward trend, and the projection for the start of the 2020 season is that there will be just 4 non-white head coaches, compared to the 3 that were in place when the Rooney Rule was introduced back in 2003. So what went wrong? It's our view that positive action alone will not level the playing field and provide equal opportunities to all. Unless you address the underlying issues, positive action in the assessment process, like the Rooney Rule, can become a box-ticking exercise. There have been numerous allegations of American football teams either not working hard enough to find diverse talent or interviewing non-white candidates, but not giving them a fair opportunity. We believe that by removing bias from the assessment process, and by making sure that everyone executing that process is well trained to provide equal opportunities to all, you don't need the Rooney Rule or other positive action within the assessment process. So how can you do that? We need an assessment process that we trust to assess which candidates have the potential for high performance, whilst removing the bias that's clearly clouding our judgment. We've already run through the bias that comes from names and looks in the study with Sandra and Maryam earlier, but there are lots of other biases that come from CVs too. If we take a CV like Robert's here, there are lots of opportunity for bias. First, we've got the halo effect, inferring ability from association with a previous employer or something else on their CV, Google in this case. Then got confirmation bias. Having already made the decision that Robert's likely to be a good candidate, we can then look to confirm what we think we already know. Whereas we may typically question why someone has left a company after 3 months, we could infer that there must be a good reason, given that Robert was hired at Google in the first place. We've got affinity bias, which is the unconscious tendency to get along with or recommend others who are like us. In this case, if you completed the Prince 2 and you know how much it's helped you with your career, you're likely to have a positive assumption about Robert's ability as a result of completing that Prince 2. Then we've got stereotype bias. 2 types of stereotype bias that I want to just quickly run through on this CV. Firstly, Robert studied at Cambridge, so must be smart and therefore good for this role, even though that may not be the case. Or more damagingly, look at the dates. He might be too old for this role, and that could restrict his access to an opportunity that he actually might be very well suited for. And finally, we've got groupthink. You've got to think about where the CV came to you from and what the context of it is. If your manager told you to review it or told you that Robert looks like a good candidate, you're far more likely to agree than if you're making that decision on your own. So it's perhaps not surprising then that a study by Schmidt and Hunter in 1998 and 2016 has shown that traditional methods of assessment, and particularly CV screening, are far less predictive of performance in the job than work sample tests, structured interviews, and general cognitive ability tests. Using the findings of this study, you can rebuild your assessment process, putting diversity first. And instead of a typical assessment that could look something like CV screening as a first stage, looking at years of experience and education, followed by a telephone interview, which is typically unstructured or often unstructured and based on the different style of the interviewer themselves. And then the most predictive part of the typical process, a panel interview, which is structured around key skills, before a meeting with the boss in an informal setting to determine whether they're the right hire, and a reference check prior to offer to make sure that you're offering the right person. And we can actually start to remove some of those elements that aren't as predictive, the CVs, for example, the reference check, and then the unstructured interviews. And we can start to put skills and predictivity first. You can then rework the assessment process to start with an optional cognitive ability test. We say that it's optional as it needs to work for you in 3 ways in order to be a really good first stage screen. Firstly, you need to be entirely confident that the test is testing the right things. Secondly, you need to ensure that the candidate experience remains really high quality. You don't want to lose great candidates by making the process too arduous up front. And finally, as with everything, it needs to work for you and your business, for example, on a cost front. We partner with Arctic Shores, who are a leading gamified testing provider, to deliver cognitive ability tests for some of our clients, and find that the approach works best when you're working at high volume. Because with high volume, you have more data and more of an understanding of what good looks like. You can then make sure that the artificial intelligence that you're using as a first stage filter is coded as accurately as possible, and therefore is a good first stage filter in the assessment process. The next stage that we do really believe in, especially for early career recruitment, is skills-based questions replacing CVs. That is, removing CVs from the process and instead asking questions focused on skills and potential. For example, with one of our clients, Ipsos Mori, we ask specific questions like, what challenges and opportunities will there be for X team that they're applying for's area of research in the next 2 years? And more general questions like, why would you like to work for Ipsos Mori? Having answers to those questions at the first stage gives you great insight and means that the biases coming from CVs are not prevalent in your early stage of the application. This has contributed to a widening of the pool of talent that's made it to interview, and in 2019 we calculated that 15% of the hires that Ipsos Mori made would have been rejected at CV screening stage if they were still following their original process for early career hiring of requiring a certain UCAS point requirement and having a certain degree requirement. The same process can work equally well for experienced roles and is absolutely best practice in our opinion. That said, it isn't the norm yet, and so you'll need to make sure that it doesn't reduce the number of applications that you're receiving from busy candidates or from people that you're proactively reaching out to, especially in a candidate-poor market. For our clients who want to use this methodology, we firmly recommend our technology partner Applied, who enable the process and provide fantastic data and insights that I'll come on to shortly. It is time-consuming, however, to implement a process like this and to execute it effectively. And that's where your internal recruitment function would need to step up to ensure that it doesn't sit with your hiring managers, who could then resent the new process and make it much less likely to be successful. You then need to make sure that all of your interviews are structured and ideally conducted by more than one person. Structured to ensure that all interviewers are clear on what they are and, as importantly, aren't assessing. Role plays, simulations, live tests or assessment centres can really help with this. And we would absolutely recommend implementing scorecards and tying your interviews to your values. We could spend a whole session on that topic and sadly don't have time for that now, but do let us know if you'd like any more information on it. And finally, you'll notice that we've kept reference checks on this sample interview structure, despite them not being very predictive. We'd advise that you make hiring decisions before taking references, so as not to fall into any of the similar bias traps that we ran through with CVs. You can then use references to get a better understanding of how to manage and work with your future hire, and then, of course, rethink if something terrible comes up. As an overview of what this process could look like with Applied, our dashboard for a role would look something like this. Note that unless you actively select to do so, you can't see the names of the candidates. This allows you to make decisions based on the performance of candidates at every stage of the process without any bias, and applying the weighting that you would like to different parts of the process. Now, when I go through this sort of approach with lots of prospective clients, the immediate reaction is, this sounds really good and interesting, but it also sounds like a lot of effort and I'm not sure we're ready. Our message there is that's absolutely fine. You need to take this at the pace that you're comfortable with. Whether that's wholesale change to your assessment process, whether that's implementing one of the elements that I've just discussed, or whether that's using a variant of the Rooney rule. The important thing here is that you act and that you make sure that this is on the radar of your senior leaders. Have a watch of our videos on influencing internally and attracting diverse talent if you haven't already, and start to make your plan on how you want to tackle this big issue and move in the right direction. And when you are ready to start changing and cementing a diversity-centric recruitment process that's right for you, our final point is to use data and reporting to drive continual iteration and improvement. The more data and reporting that you have, the better. It's important to say here that in order to have data and then reports, we need candidates' sensitive information. So we need to make it clear to candidates up front that any data they give us will only ever be used for reporting and to improve our assessment processes, not to make decisions on who to hire. Ideally, you'll then be able to break down candidate sources by diversity and see how candidates from different backgrounds perform throughout the assessment process, as well as the results and how they're changing over time. And that's where you can delve in to then look to make improvements to parts of the process that aren't performing as you'd like them to. And that's where Applied can be a really helpful tool too. They can provide you with all of the data that you want from a diversity perspective and more. And by doing things anonymously, we're able to provide candidates with high quality feedback on each stage of the assessment process, if they want it, which further improves candidate experience and our employer brand in the process, having the auxiliary benefit of then driving more candidates in the future. So whether you're using Applied, your existing ATS, or doing things manually, use the data and reporting that you are able to access in order to drive continual improvement in your quest for an ever more diverse assessment process and an ever more diverse and inclusive organisation. And although there's an awfully long way to go, hopefully as a professional community, we can get to a position where our process is so good that we no longer need the Rooney rule or other positive action in our assessment. So in summary, whether we like it or not, we all have unconscious biases that we need to overcome in the assessment process. Positive actions such as the Rooney rule can be a great first step if we're able to avoid the traps of positive discrimination. But in our opinion, it's a better long-term approach to focus on continual improvements to our assessment process, driven by both academic insight and the data and reporting that we're then able to access as we implement those changes. And while it may sound like there's a lot to do, there's never been a better time to start making those improvements. Don't wait around, because one of two things will happen. Either, and we firmly hope that this won't be the case, the world will move on and we'll lose the momentum that's been generated by the Black Lives Matter movement. Or companies around the UK will act, and yours will be the one playing catch up, both in the UK and globally, and explaining to your employees, as well as potential future hires, why you were so slow to act. Before I finish, I just wanted to say another massive thanks to the academics, Applied, and all of the resources that we've used today to create this video. We hope we've done your work justice. And if you haven't already, we recommend that you now review the other two core components of the instant impact methodology for driving diversity through recruitment, influencing internally, and attracting diverse candidates. Also keep an eye out for future resources that will continue to add to our diversity hub. If you have any questions or feedback, or there's anything that we can do to help you with that instant impact, then please do get in touch. Thanks for watching this video on removing bias from your assessment process. We hope that you'll have taken away a few key points from it and that will help your business to become more diverse and inclusive.